The Search Podcast USA Edition series is sponsored by Ascen. Ascen is a top employer of record in North America that exclusively helps staffing and recruitment agencies hire contractors compliantly throughout the US and Canada. Ascen's all-in-one white-label platform handles onboarding, timesheets, payroll, benefits, insurance, invoicing, and optional financing so you can grow quickly in the US and Canada. Start growing your staffing agency in the US today with Ascen. Visit us at ascen.com.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Search Podcast, to all about the US, in this edition. It's been coming up to, I think we're nearly on 100 episodes now. And since I've done this for the last few years, everything has been about the States. And I believe that every year it's becoming more and more of a hot subject in the industry, specifically within the recruitment space. That has been a huge talking point, and in some cases actually saved a lot of recruitment companies from going under because they've been focused on the US market and have put their investment on their expansion over to the US. So this week I've got a very special guest with me who is not a recruitment business owner in this instance, I don't think anyway, and has offered and is offering the industry something very lucrative right now, where I'm asked on a weekly basis questions around this. So hopefully, this guest and I can go through a few of those key areas that you guys are wondering and, getting the information on. But I'd like to introduce you to Paul. Do you want to take away a bit more about
Yeah,
who you are and where you're from?
yeah. Thanks, Elliott. Yeah, my name is Paul Samartin. I'm a U.S. immigration lawyer based in the city of London. Our firm, Samartin and Friends, deals extensively in the recruitment industry, so helping founders and businesses go to the U.S. We only operate in the U.S. immigration area, so we are experts in this field. Our firm currently has a total of 17 employees, and we focus, totally on U.S. immigration.
Awesome. And you're based in London, or are you
Yeah,
based?
based in the city. Yep.
Yeah, awesome. So, because I'm assuming you're American, right?
I'm
So,
American, yeah, for my sins. Yeah.
fine.
I've been in the UK for 23 years now, and I've only practiced immigration law during that period of time. So,
Perfect, fine. So I'm going to start off the biggest question that I've got, which I think most people have been wondering, and back in Q4 last year, people were kind of weary of. But has anything changed with the new administration in the US when it comes to immigration for British citizens?
yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's also super loaded because you read a lot of things in the press about this happened to this person or this happened to that person. I think some of those stories, I would say they would have happened regardless of what administration was in power in the U.S. Some of them wouldn't. So a lot of the focus on trying to remove people or deny entry to people who were anti-Israel or pro-Palestine. That is a new type of thing that we haven't seen previously in other administrations. But it kind of lines up with Trump's kind of first administration, where he barred some citizens of some countries from coming to the U.S. And we all are waiting for that to happen again in this term, and those are typically going to be the same types of countries from last time. So those are countries that the Trump administration believes either aren't upholding their end of the bargain in terms of limiting, criminals or criminality, or taking citizens back from the U.S. who have overstayed and are unauthorized in the U.S., and then those that might have like a terrorist or national security element to it. So I don't. From what we've seen, it doesn't list. They don't list any European countries
No.
within the EU or the UK, so there's no kind of concern there. One thing we haven't seen really, that I assume is probably in the works, is during the Trump's first administration, he had issued a executive order called Buy American, Hire American, so it's called BAHA for short, and that did kind of impact recruitment consultancy firms because there was a real focus on making sure that companies that were looking to send people to the U.S. were actually looking to hire US people first instead of just trying to fill them in with employees from the UK or new hires from the UK that they wanted to send to the US for whatever reason. So that I think really hasn't gone away. The embassy in London pre 2017 wasn't very aggressive with those kind of specialist cases, but since then and continuing through Biden's administration, that was a problem for recruitment consultancy firms, especially when they're specialist employees. If they don't have a degree or don't have, four plus years of experience in the field, that was problematic. Also, we've seen an uptick in denials where a recruitment company hires somebody that they want to then send to the US because the kind of understanding that the embassy has is why didn't you just hire a US person? Why are you hiring a UK person and sending them to the US? So we try to advise clients to make sure that you kind of have employees that actually work for the company or who have worked for the company who are working in the same industry in terms of where they're recruiting. So if they're doing like SaaS recruitment and then you want them to do life sciences recruitment and they have no experience in that, the embassy again is going to say, why do you need this person? You could just find somebody in the
Yeah.
US who has
I
that experience.
I mean, there's a couple of questions on that I'd like to
Yeah,
ask, and I did witness within my own agency last year. We had someone that was rejected at the embassy that specialized in cybersecurity recruitment, but
right.
they got to the US embassy, and one of the questions they was asked is, "What makes you a specialist in
Yeah,
cybersecurity recruitment?" And you don't have a qualification in it, you don't have experience in it, and he was like, "Yeah, but I recruit in it," and they were like, "Well, that's not a specialist, is it? You're not
yeah,
good enough."
yeah,
Rejection.
yeah,
And I don't think he was, in my opinion, prepared for the questioning, and the maybe CV resume at the time wasn't presented strong enough to make sure that he could have that success rate that he needed, and he was put in a bad spot. Um, which goes on to the next point. Have you seen a lot more? Because I have personally seen more rejections more recently than I have done before. Is it because they're just tightening up the process a bit more?
yeah. So there's a couple things that happen. One, just to kind of give you an understanding of how the State Department works and each U.S. consular post work. So effectively, the Foreign Service officers, so the consular officers who are interviewing applicants, they rotate through multiple posts. And the reason they do that, one is they want the Foreign Service nationals to have more experience, working in different places, but also to kind of combat that kind of potential for any kind of undue influence by outside forces. So if somebody's living somewhere for 20 years and they get comfortable, they get to know people, they might be more open to doing things that are a bit nefarious. So that's a protection mechanism that the State Department uses to avoid that situation. So these officers rotated. So what happens sometimes, you get officers who rotate into London or whatever consular post you're dealing with that might have a more aggressive approach to recruitment consultants. So in 2017, we had the head of the VC unit, who was an ex Ernst and Young consultant, who just felt like recruitment consultants weren't specialists, right? You had to have a really high level, and because of that, the team that he managed kind of uh, that kind of viewpoint permeated through to the other consular officers. But the way the interview process works is effectively you could see one of 20 consular officers, depending on who they are and where they're at. They split between the passport unit and the American Citizen Services unit and the VC unit. So you could have an officer who just doesn't think that the person has the specialism because maybe they have a background in cybersecurity or they have a degree in software engineering, and they're saying you couldn't actually be a specialist in this field if you've not actually,
Yeah.
practiced in it, you have a degree in it, etc. So that's a problem. You also get officers who don't like this type of role, like a recruitment consultant, because they might view it as more sales. So, okay, well, anybody can do sales, right? That's what some of the attitudes are. So we really want to focus on what their specialism is, and if that's knowledge of the actual industry, that's really important. If it's how they deal with clients, like if they're doing a lot of the HR function in terms of the recruitment, helping with consulting clients on retaining employees once they've recruited them. All sorts of different things you can look at within the recruitment space to help bolster that case to show that they're specialists. But I would say your comment and that example you used is really a hard sell. You have somebody who has no background in cybersecurity. and then you're sending them in to recruit in cybersecurity in the US. How are they going to do their job,
Yeah.
right? So what's the narrative? Are they a specialist as a recruiter? Okay, then what does that entail, right? So it's about trying to understand, and what we do with our clients is trying to understand what the role is, what the background the person has. And the reality is, we're not going to be able to get an approval every time, right? So if the case is bad, right? If you have a lawyer who says this is fine, they'll get approved, then maybe you should have a different lawyer,
Yeah.
because you should have lawyers that are looking at the case going, this is just a pile of shit, to be frank, and we shouldn't be sending this person in because it's not going to get approved. So maybe we'll have this person work in the UK office for 6 months or maybe a year. Maybe we'll put them in an area where they actually have experience in. So that's so you can build that case, so you can make that argument. So a lot of times we're looking at cases and going, what is it? What can we prove here? How can we bolster this case? How can we make it provable? And sometimes you can't, because the facts just don't work for
Yeah.
you.
I'm contacted on a regular, and this is good for people that are in recruitment, as in the individuals rather than the businesses as well, to understand that if you want to go to the US and you do, example, healthcare recruitment, and you're trying to get to the States and you feel like you can just go into any sector, as much as companies over there might potentially entertain it, the
Yeah.
embassy will make it very difficult for you because you have zero exposure and experience to that market. And it just is a complete waste of time. And if anything, it's just you're kind of building yourself up in most cases to just be let down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that's a huge thing. And that's something we try to do, is just managing expectations, because the reality is that, if you don't have a good case, we can always make the application. you know, we obviously prep our clients really well. We make sure we have valid arguments that we can go and the person can go and sell themselves. But it will a lot of times depend on how the person does at the interview, right? And how the consular officer perceives them and their specialism. So if they can't really sell themselves, one, maybe they shouldn't be in recruitment if they
yeah.
can't sell themselves. But the other thing is,
True,
maybe there's
true.
nothing to sell, right? Maybe it's just that the fact is the person doesn't really qualify.
Yeah,
And what we tell clients is like, look, if you want to do this application, the applicant needs to understand that this is a flip of a coin case. And
yeah,
if they get denied, the biggest impact is then they lose access to the US. So their ESTA, they can't get an ESTA, they can't travel on the visa waiver program. So they have to apply for a visitor visa at a later time to
yeah,
get access back to the US. So it's not a huge loss, but I think if you're not managing the applicants' expectations and they think they're going to the US, then they've got this whole thing built up. They probably already started living their life in New York or Austin or wherever they're going to be, North Carolina, and they get the denial and it's really crushing, and then you lose that employee
yeah,
as opposed to maybe we'll wait 6 months and reapply.
yeah, absolutely. And in terms of like, most questions asked are obviously around, E2 visas, it's the most
Yeah.
common area of how businesses kind of work. I've personally used an L1 visa for my team. So I know the process on that, but I guess everyone wants to know this particular question. The answer to this particular question is, if you're setting up in the US, and there's a two-part to this
Yeah,
question, is
fine.
what time frame would you say from the minute they engage with you to the minute that they can have their visa and get over to the US, is one question that I'm asked a lot. The second question that I'm asked a lot is, um, how much do they need to invest? Because I hear so many rumors of, oh yeah, you can't do it unless you invest 100 grand, and then it's,
Yeah.
is it 50 grand? Sometimes it's 30 grand. So two parts of the question is the time frame from start to kind of being able to get over there, number one, roughly. And number
Yeah.
two is, how much money do you need to invest?
Right. Okay. So the first question, I'm going to basically punt on it as a lawyer. I will explain what I'm talking about, but I can give you the processing times. But the biggest problem with something like an E2 is you actually have to do the investment before we can actually make the application. And
Yeah,
the company has to be either operational in the US or on the cusp of being operational. So if you've not done anything except for incorporated business, you've not spent any money. We have to wait until you actually make the spend, which
yeah,
I'll segue into in a minute. So taking out how much work the company needs to do before we're in a position to actually file. For a law firm, it typically takes a couple weeks. I say 2 to 4 weeks to prepare the case. for a company registration, which is the longer process, and the first visa application. And then once it's submitted to the embassy, they're taking about 14 to 16 weeks to review the application and then to actually okay it for interview. Then it's probably another 4 to 6 weeks to do the interview. So we tell clients about 4.5 to 5 months is the
Yeah.
current processing. Now that obviously once a company's registered with the embassy and approved, getting employees in to apply, is much quicker. It's 4 to 6 weeks, so it's a much quicker
Yeah.
process after that. So yeah, there is a bit of a time waste, but the E2 is such a good vehicle for sending employees to the U.S. that companies would be dumb not to use it, right? It's the best visa. You get the longest visa, 5 years. There's no kind of time limits in terms of like how many E2s you can have. Like we have clients who've had E2s for 20 plus years, right? There's no kind of drive to get them green cards. You don't have to do that. Whereas something with the L1, you're quite limited in scope in terms of timing, right? For a new office L1, which is if the company's been operating in the US for less than a year, it's a year visa. To get that extended, it's quite difficult. Then you can get it extended for 2 years for a max of 5 years for a specialist or 7 years for a manager or executive before you actually have to do something with them. So maybe at year two, you're looking at green cards for a specialist, which you
Yeah.
wouldn't do on an E2. So there's a lot more flexibility. Also with the E2, you don't have to have previous work experience at the company, even though, as I alluded to earlier, it really helps. So even though under the guidance, you can just hire somebody and send them to the US, the reality is it doesn't look good and it looks like you're trying to circumvent the US labor market, which is
Yeah.
problematic. Um, so that is the first question answered. So in terms of investment, all right. So this is kind of where Google's a problem and also other U.S. immigration lawyers,
Yeah.
because so the 100,000, I've explained this so many times, the $100,000 investment bit that you see all over the place was there's a manual called the Foreign Affairs Manual, and it's what the U.S. consular officers use to kind of adjudicate cases, and it has a lot of information in there in terms of like what the requirements are for an E2, even all the other visa categories, L, O, H, whatever. In a really old iteration of this, I think in the 90s, they had an example of what qualifies as an E2 investor. And it was like, it's a services business. The person's invested $100,000. And then everybody went, you have to invest $100,000 in this, right? And even some consular officers at some consular posts, not the UK, were using that as like the litmus test, like the baseline. It has to be 100,000. And then what the State Department did in the early 2000s is they removed that example because it was confusing because consular officers were going, you need to invest 100,000, right? So the reality is the investment should be um, what's called proportional and substantial in terms of what the business is, right? So if you're doing a manufacturing business, right, it should be a substantial investment because the cost of setting up that business is substantial,
Yeah.
right? Whereas if you're setting up a services business, the cost of setting up a service business might be a laptop and an incorporation, right? So it's a lot lower, right? So what we do is we look at the type of business it is and then look at what the cost of actual setup is and then advise what the cost spend should be. But for recruitment consultants, we typically say about $20,000 to $30,000, right? And those costs need to be what I call core investment. So those are things like incorporation. So if you pay a lawyer to do that, tax advice, trademark search, trademark advice, any kind of licenses that are purchased for the US company. So it can't be any spend that's done, let's say, incubating in the UK for the US, that won't count. But
End costs.
yeah, it has to be US focused, right? If you're doing a separate website for the US market, or you're changing your website to include the US market and the US business, that could count. Lawyer fees for immigration, our fees don't count, but they can go into like an ancillary pot. So I talk about like three. This is like an old U.S. Law school kind of conversation. They talk about buckets and for trust, and they say, oh, for trust, you have a bucket, you put everything in. So I use buckets as an analogy, but you sort of have three buckets. You have this main bucket, which is what I would call primary investment. So this is the actual setup cost, what it costs you to set up that business. Then you have what are called ancillary costs. So you took a flight to the US. We can't go to the embassy and say that was a setup cost because you don't need to take a flight to the US to set up a business, right?
Yeah.
So that goes into ancillary pot. And then the third thing would be cash in bank. And we sort of use all of them in the aggregate and say, look, this is the total investment. But that core investment, that first bucket investment, that you want to hit about 20,000. Office space also counts. So if you get actual office space or you get virtual office space, if you're already employing people in the US or contractors, those costs count.
Yeah.
Really, we look at things on the totality of the evidence and say, look, this investment, maybe you have 10,000 here, you probably need to spend a bit more to get to around 20,000. But yeah, it doesn't need to be a huge amount. Like we've had some that were even less. We've done one-man band recruitment consultancies that were started in the UK and then they got traction in the US market and they went, well, I want to go to the US because that's where all my clients are. That investment, I think we did one that was about 17 grand. But it's a stronger case because you have that US clientele, so that also does help.
Does it, sorry to jump in there, Paul, like if
Yeah,
someone wants to, really kind of use a lump of it, let's say they hire someone in the US and put them through an employer record provider,
yeah,
they get, $60,000, $70,000 payroll salary
yeah,
person, and they also get, let's say the employer record fees are $400 or $500 a
yeah.
month. They can incorporate that into the expenditure.
Yeah, they can 100% can, but just to kind of reiterate to like the whole fact of the investment has to be for the setup of the business and like early operations. So if that's all they've done and they've not spent money on or incorporating or spent money on getting that business operational or on the cusp of being operational, that would be a problem, right? So we couldn't just go in and say they have one employee and they spent all this money on that employee, but they've not spent any money setting up the business. That would be problematic, right?
Yeah,
So if you were trying to do it a bit, if you didn't do POE and you did something like you set up your own entity, then, or you can do POE, I guess EOR is what I was saying, it doesn't
yeah,
really work. But if you set up your own entity and you did POE, then you've got the cost going to the POE, then you've got your employees on the books and you've paid to incorporate. That's probably a stronger case, right, than
yeah.
doing something like EOR.
Pretty much what I did when
Yeah.
in 2018, I hired two people in America, put them through a PEO. I had an entity already set
Yeah,
up.
right. Yeah.
And then 3 years later, I was like, okay, well, we've got 3 years worth of accounts. We've had
Yeah.
staff over their office. I didn't have to actually go through any investment process because I'd
Yeah.
already done it.
Yeah, you've already done it. Yeah. So if you're gonna, so that is very different than what a lot of companies do here, which they tend to incubate in the UK, and
Yeah.
then once they built up their team, they go. Now, another visa that's not talked about a lot is like the sibling to the E2, which is called the E1, which is based on trade between the US and UK. So a lot of times we're able to get E1 visas for people because they've incubated in the UK and they have, let's say, most of their work is with the US. And so they can show this trade between the US and the UK. And that way they can actually get e-visas for their team before they've actually set up in the US and before they've actually invested. So it's a really good way to kind of circumvent needing to invest in the US and basically count your chickens before they hatch, because that's the problem with the E2. You can spend 30, 40,000 and then apply for the visa and get denied. Now, we don't see that, and our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. But, we've heard horror stories like that before. So the E1's a good vehicle. The good thing about it, too, is that the trade's already in existence, so we don't have to show any kind of future investment or any kind of growth other than just the trade is going to continue. So what that tends to look like is we just need to prove that at least 50% of the international trade is with the US, and that's substantial. And we've had cases to prove where $60,000 was substantial in 1 year. So it's not a huge amount of trade. But it's probably the fastest way to get an E visa because you don't have to do the investment, so that you can just look at like this is what the trade's been.
Yeah.
And just to kind of further clarify the trade, it's international trade, so it doesn't count UK domestic. So we're just looking at UK company trading with the US versus rest of the world minus UK domestic.
Awesome. You've answered a couple of my next questions within that anyway.
Cool. All right, that's
But no,
great.
look, Paul, I think from this and the industry and the market and the connections that I've got, they ask these questions on a regular basis. They're all interested in the American markets. They all want to know what they need to do to get over there, how it can be done. There's a lot of followers on this podcast that will probably reach out to you as well and ask you lots of questions, and
Cool.
hopefully,
Happy to help.
gives you a lot of potential clients as well at the same time. Bit kind of conscious on timing, Paul, but ultimately, a lot of what you've shared is extremely valuable, more than you may realize. Like these are the biggest subjects in the area that I deal with, and ultimately what people want and need to know. Um, as quickly as you can, where are the top locations at the minute that you're seeing more movement and traction from UK to US?
Yeah, so I think like the typical recruitment hubs like Manchester,
Yeah,
London, we're seeing lots of movement there. Going to the US, you probably Austin, I think that's kind of slowing down a bit more because I don't think it's as
yeah,
cheap as it was originally. So we're seeing people move to, North Carolina. Florida is always popular. So those kind of low tax jurisdictions. And then just the typical ones like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles. But I think people are really led by where their clients are,
yeah,
right? And where they're recruiting into. So like if you're doing tech, it's going to be either Austin, New York, or San Francisco. If you're doing, maybe life sciences, it's going to be somewhere totally different, New York probably.
yeah.
But yeah, I think it seems to be a steady stream of people moving. I do feel like recruitment's a good kind of test for what the economy is doing as well, of course, because when things are frothy in the recruitment market, it tends to be that the economy is doing well. It doesn't appear that Trump and his policies have kind of you know, taper the excitement of the U.S. stock market have kind of impacted companies yet, and we're not seeing like a slowdown of recruitment
Good.
in those in the U.S. and in the main industries. But I envision that, okay, I'm not an economist, but if the tariffs are going to impact the U.S. economy, it might do. It's just really hard to say.
Yeah.
But I'm not seeing that so far.
Good. Well, there's no slowdown in it. I mean, the UK economy is not the strongest at the minute. It's not the
No.
best. It's not the nicest of markets, especially in the recruitment industry.
Yeah.
And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, there's a lot of companies that have survived purely on the fact that they've been recruiting and managing their business within the US. That's
Yeah.
brought a huge return on their investment. So a lot more companies are seeing that opportunity now. Paul, I really appreciate all of this information that you've provided. If anyone has any questions, reach out to these guys. They're awesome, and they've helped a couple of my clients, with regards to getting their visas and getting themselves situated in the States. But just from an informative perspective, I think, do you have like a 15-minute or any kind of consultation that you offer?
Yeah, so yeah, we tend to be pretty generous with consultations, especially with corporate clients. So I usually do 30-minute calls without
Cool.
charge. For individuals, it really depends on what the fact pattern is, right? So if it's
Yeah,
really complicated, it might be that we charge for it because it's a
yeah,
mess. Or, if it's I just want to go work in the US, find a job and then
yeah.
come find me.
Right. If anyone is serious about it and is on the verge of kind of getting themselves situated over there because they've been operating the US market from the UK, reach out to these guys. Information will be on all of the podcast channels and social media points that are going out there. Paul, once again, thank you very much for all of
All right.
this. And
Thanks for having me.
I'm no pleasure. I look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, all right. Take care. Thanks, guys.